Exceptional Randos show is produced live in Sunroom Studios' Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or a question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
Well, that was random. Exceptional Radio. It is the second we don't really get to see that kind of stuff too much. I feel like it's people are getting better about it, but it's just insidious bullshit. But that's the nature of our system right now. We're getting lots of crap. They're lying about. It seems like they're lying about everything. They're lying about the numbers. They're lying about the efficacy of treatments. They're lying about what's available. They're lying about the safety of children in schools. And lo and behold, there have been a few schools that have opened up, and kids already are testing positive for this stuff. So now they've got to shut down. It's just all happening too quickly. But what can you do?
Well, I'm starting to see teachers quit their jobs because they're being effectively forced to do in-person teaching if they choose to keep their position. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a massive surge of teachers quitting within the next 2 months before school starts.
Well, I think that's the only way they're going to be able to do it. I mean, they've got it. The teachers are the ones that are taking the big risk. I mean, so are the kids, of course, and then downstream, so are the parents. But I think it's important that everyone needs to understand that this isn't going to jumpstart the economy the way they think it is. We're now it seems like we're getting shipping from China seems to be getting somewhat back to normal. Except I read that the current guy in charge of the post office, he's been screwing things up like all over the place. So there have been anecdotal stories of people who run a small business and they rely on the post office for shipping, and for the past several years or as long as they've been in business, they've been able to send their products through the postal service, track it, and expect to get their package to the destination in a reasonable amount of time as estimated by the post office. And since this guy's taken over, some people are waiting up to a month to get a product delivered in the United States, shipped from the United States. And so, you know, I got a I bought a guitar from China. It took 4 months to get here. I bought a wok, ladle, and spatula, and it took 3 months to get here. And I ordered the spatula setup from Amazon, so it was only supposed to take a week. And so I ordered those back in like February and March, and they got here in June. And that's just, I think that was because China's shipping industry, their export industry, got hit really hard before anyone else, and it took them a while to get back on track. And so that means that if there's a 4 month gap in just basic items making it here, and we're just now recovering. We're just into August. We're 2 months out of June, where it seems like China might have gotten their act back together. That's still 3 months where there was nothing coming in, and no amount of activity, no amount of additional economic activity is going to save that whole middleman industry, the private label industry, because their products are just weren't in the pipeline. And if there is an actual production shortage in China, which I'm pretty sure they've got that sorted out by now, then none of those products are going to be there. And we know that we've been tracking the prices of audio electronics and microphones specifically, and some microphones are just not available. We were looking at a certain brand of microphone, and Chris pointed out that, hey, this thing is like 14 to 20 days delayed just to get it to the vendor, and then the vendors are saying we can't ship for another 8 to 10 days. Like, how how is the private label industry going to survive this? I mean, I know that the service industry is keen on getting back to delivering their services, and there are always going to be some services that are necessary, that are essential, uh, you know, construction and cleaning services, because you got to keep those public spaces clean somehow. And I mean, what else?
So you
There's
you're
no amount
t-
of stimulus that's going to save that small private label industry if they don't have products to sell, because the entire uh, delivery infrastructure is being undermined by the people that are running it.
so one of the the main theoretical framework that I'm putting forth in my book that I that I call proto dynamism as a transition into what would be dynamism, or effectively looking at economics in terms of dynamos and engines, and applying um, thermoeconomics on a large scale. A lot of people don't realize thermoeconomics is a thing. I didn't invent that word or concept, but it's not really taught in America because it's just too, in its simplicity, it's too complex for most Americans to understand. So most Americans aren't even familiar with like the actual macro and micro principles, and end up just having this weird understanding of economics that's bastardized through the military industrial lens. But in my framework, the whole concept of proto-dynamism is that the only way forward as a society is to kill the middleman off in all these transactions, because the middleman is the one that's like sucking all the energy out from both sides. And this is like, now that the shipping is making it happen effectively on a accelerated schedule, it not only reinforces what I was saying in the book, but it's this element of, when you have economies driven by middlemen, speculators, it really is just a matter of time before that shit falls apart. And then you have to really have people who know what they're doing to pick it up and put it back together correctly. Otherwise, you just end up with more middlemen bullshit. And that's kind of where our government is trying to stall everything to put middlemen in place. But it's increasingly difficult to put middlemen in place when the landscape and demands that you can't really have middlemen, or else whatever it is, it doesn't matter what it is. If there's a middleman involved in 2020, that shit's gonna probably die out fairly quickly, just because you can't. There's there's too much demand for transparency, and once there's transparency, that middleman becomes obsolete very quickly.
Yeah, you can't hide your product pricing if everyone knows what your products cost from the manufacturer. It just doesn't work like that.
Well,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jay.
I was going to say what we see, and you guys really touched on a lot of these points. It demonstrates how much the most powerful elements of government and industry are willing to ignore for the sake of profit. So, in regards to shipping, in regards to the postal system, you have the disenfranchisement of the postal worker, things like overtime being denied, things like labeling processes being bogged down intentionally. For our educators, we have the disenfranchisement of the educator by essentially forcing them to choose between their lives and their livelihoods. But how much can they really contribute if their lives are essentially being put into danger? Unfortunately, they pass away. So it's like there's obviously an incentive to the disenfranchisement of millions of people. Otherwise, there would be a system in place that would be designed to keep people from getting disenfranchised. There would be some sort of social safety net. And in regards to the elimination of the middleman, all of these industries that started to collapse, all of the service industry, all of the small businesses that began to disintegrate once their owners and proprietors were unable to pay for their mortgages or pay for their small business loans. Essentially, they got snapped up or bought up, or the economy itself got propped up, or the government got propped up by large-scale financial interactions with extraordinarily large industrial representatives. So you have the government trading in bonds with and debt with Berkshire Hathaway, McDonald's, other large companies. You have Amazon making billions and billions of dollars. You have Tesla making billions and billions of dollars, and all of these companies use the business model of diversification. They never really put their eggs into one basket. They try and get the most bang for their buck in order to finance their operations, in addition to funding through private equity or through government subsidy. So what we're trending towards is the domination of the middleman structure by organizations that will essentially monopolize entire industries of distribution and supply chain, because there won't be anybody to essentially stand in their path. The small businesses that aren't able to sustain themselves, see, the main issue with that from a financial sector perspective is that there's going to be a bunch of people who are defaulting on their loans, and they're going to have to surrender their assets. So all of those assets will, in essence, be liquidated and balled up and fed into whatever bank or whatever, private bank or credit union system that provided the loan in the first place, or the whatever was secured against the loan. And then with the elimination of all of these small businesses, you're going to have the opportunist, large industry actors use the accumulation of all of that surrendered wealth to their advantage.
I think that's the classic scenario that tends to play out in these in these over leveraged periods. But I don't know if you guys heard of. Well, I'm not trying to laugh at it. I'm laughing at the prospect of people who think that this type of shit is going to go down without people rebelling en masse. Because there was a landlord that just got fucking decapitated.
Oh shit! Really?
In California. Yeah, that shit just happened. So it's like when we're talking about these people doing this shit again, that ain't happening, man. Like I'm not trying to burst anybody's bubble thinking that they're just gonna fucking buy up a bunch of land after all these people default on their shit, or they're trying to kick out 30 million Americans out of their homes and thinking they're just gonna do that shit again. There's already been one landlord decapitated in 2020, like straight up.
It was in
with
Hartford,
a fucking
Connecticut.
sword.
Holy good, Hartford with a sword.
Fucking sword. So I'm saying these people, they think they're gonna do this shit again. They got a goddamn another thing coming. If they think that they can have the NRA do all this shit about Second Amendment stuff and then have all these landlords thinking that they're just gonna kick a bunch of people out on the street because the government refused to fucking help Americans in the midst of a pandemic, that ain't happening, man. That's what would have happened if there was only 2 million people affected. If this was 1996, if this was Los Angeles and you could isolate it to Los Angeles, that's what would have happened. But this is all across the country right now, and they're not gonna be able to pull that bullshit. They're gonna try it, but there will be more landlords decapitated.
He used a katana.
I get that gonna happen. I'm just saying in the sense of it's already happened. That's not even a hypothetical in 2020. That shit has already started. So
dude legit took a katana to his landlord's head.
Yeah, man. And the landlord had defensive lacerations on his arms, so he tried to fucking stop that shit, but nah, he lost his head because he was trying to kick somebody out during the fucking pandemic, and that person had nothing left to lose. You know what happens when somebody has nothing left to lose and you try to kick them out on the street during a pandemic and that person has a fucking sword?
Literally all the bad things that you can think of.
Yeah, all these rich people think that the fucking police are going to be there to protect them from that dude, because he had an incident before where they were trying to kick him out and the landlord called the cops, and because the dude had just had a sword and was like, threatening the guy, they just couldn't really do anything in the sense of, I just don't think people really, when they're playing with people's lives and they're saying, oh yeah, I'm going to kick you out because I had a financial contract with you, and my contract was to give you shelter, and now that you can't give your end of that, I'm taking away your shelter. That's a fucking hostage situation. So when you have people in hostage situations on the verge of being homeless in the middle of a pandemic, don't be surprised when they start taking off somebody's head. That shit is just, that's a fucking, you put somebody in a goddamn corner, that's what happens, man. And then they're all like trying to eulogize the landlord as if he's some great fucking dude. Oh, he was a bridge player. He held people hostage he held people's well-being hostage for fucking money because capitalism told him to do that shit, and he couldn't see beyond that. And in the middle of a fucking pandemic, he was about to throw a human being out on the fucking street. Well,
that sucks.
That's what. That's how you lose your head.
Yeah.
That's how you straight up lose your fucking head. I'm not even condoning that shit. I'm just saying there's not a whole lot of situations in which people end up losing their head in 2020. Apparently, being a landlord, trying to throw somebody out during a pandemic when unemployment is at an all-time fucking high, underemployment is at an all-time high. The fucking government's trying to lie about it and put Americans in a vulnerable situation by denying them stimulus aid, by denying them unemployment aid. I had a friend who had this literal bone cancer, got denied disability. You're trying to tell me you're going to deny a fucking person with cancer disability and not expect people to start losing their heads? Okay, that's some naive ass shit in 2020. Because I remember when they told people to let them eat cake, they went and got fucking guillotines. So people just need to research their history, man, and realize like if you push humans to a certain point en masse, they're not just gonna sit back and take that shit. Heads will come off.
You know,
and I'm trying to tell people that shit, like in the sense of that's just fucking history, man. That's just history.
During stimulus
like 2020.
During stimulus one, there were quite a few, loose instructional or DIY blogs. I guess you can do it type stuff, and they're explaining how to break down the $1,200 stimulus to produce a guillotine. And I'm pretty sure that I could make a guillotine for less than $1,200. I think I could actually make a trebuchet for $1,200. Not a big one, but a sufficient one. But, just like you're saying, people have a limit, and it really does. It's really, truly important that education is valued the way that it should be, because our society might have been able to see this was coming sooner than what we got now, because it doesn't have to be this way. We don't have to put up with a government that's trying to kill us.
That sounds absurd. It's like, I mean, but it's so obvious in this year that our government is, I think people have a hard time putting together the whole Social Security framing. It's like Social Security is not your identification. It's not meant for identification. It's meant to track your contributions into an account to then track how much you're going to receive back on that account. Why do they give that to you when you're a baby? Because they need to make sure as soon as you start fucking earning money that they can track that shit. A lot of people are like, well, it's like the government tracking you, they're keeping, they can't come up with a rational explanation as to why the government needs to track a person, when in reality, it's not tracking the person, it's tracking that person's financial contributions to the system, because we have, what it is we have a debt that we have not paid that was the charter. I mean, there were so many charters that we haven't paid back, but we have so many debts that we need to pay off, so that our government promises output and has to make sure that citizens put so much output to pay off that debt. And when people talk about, where's the national debt go? It's because our government keeps making these fucking deals on our behalf, because our people are too fucking ignorant to know what they're doing. It's like, who do we owe, Jupiter or Thanos? Like, no, we owe a bunch of fucking war profiteers and a bunch of bankers that have been doing this shit for centuries, and it's not some sort of conspiracy. It's just government making fucking deals on its citizens' behalf over and over and over, to the point that that's why we have so much national debt, and that's why we start getting tracked when we're fucking babies to see, oh, if you get a job when you're 14 and you start paying taxes on it, they're going to make sure that you fucking pay taxes on that shit as long as it's working for somebody. They're going to give you some sort of certification to make sure that you're not missing schoolwork. But if you're 14, because I got my first job at 14, they're going to figure out how to get some employment out of you. They don't just straight up plant some drugs on you and send you to fucking juvenile detention and have you working for 15 cents an hour as a goddamn kid acting like slavery is over.
Yeah, well, we also have this really incredible deal with the Saudis, and which is why oil is valued in USD for the most part, where you can't do anything in this country without a car, or at least you got to engage in some kind of mass transit, which means fuel has to be consumed. It's actually kind of insidious. We had an economy in the early 1900s where electric cars. There were more electric car options than there were gasoline vehicles. Uh, and that somehow lost. We had mass transit throughout the extensively developed cities that was sufficient to provide people with transportation without having to own an automobile. But at some point,
it up when you say it.
Yeah, I mean,
it's 100%.
That's the problem, is that our society is so geared towards this gotta filter money up to the top. It's like that joke about trickle down economics that most people won't get. But
so to your point of the rioting or the rebellion that might ensue once people are put into a position where they have to choose between essentially life and death. In the 1930s and shortly after the Great Depression, when unemployment, starvation, disenfranchisement, homelessness was at an all-time high, there was identified a need essentially to try and off-put the potential for increased amounts of societal unrest, because there was actually societal unrest. There were destructions of property. There were situations where people were engaging in, essentially justified violent behavior to draw attention to their plight, and that led to I believe the New Deal. That led to the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, and also the establishment of the Social Security Administration. But it provided the framework for public works and the opportunity for the general public that was up until that point highly unemployed to find opportunities in public works and conservation and infrastructure rehabilitation. So like building bridges, fixing roads, maintaining national parks, things like that. And those were jobs that were given to people in order to stave off what was slowly becoming, or even quickly becoming, an inevitable long-term financial decline. It was a way to also stimulate the economy. And Social Security, I don't believe it was meant to be a long-term financial safety net. I think it was meant to last for perhaps several decades, and then the United States was supposed to have adjusted to a more equitable redistribution of wealth by that point. So,
well, Social Security is good for retirees, and I think when it was established, people weren't expected to live as long as they do now. I mean, people live 20 years, 30 years after retiring now.
It's good in theory in that the premise is good, except they didn't do the math right. So the actual payments aren't enough for the cost of living now. So it did not take into account inflation. So you end up having people who get Social Security payments who have to end up working. Like my mom gets Social Security payments and still works because the Social Security payments are nowhere near enough to cover her cost of living on their own. There's nowhere near.
Social Security.
And look, if you look at the estimated payout ages when they instituted it versus the mortality rates and ages at the payout ages, they were never meaning to pay those things out because the science just caught up to mortality rates, and then people started dying later and later. And then they started bumping up the payout age because they're like, oh shit, we thought you were gonna die at like 55, so we had it at 65. Now you're dying at 70. We're gonna set it at
72. Oh wait, you're living to 80 or 90 even?
We're gonna set it at 105, and they moving the
Asshole.
fucking age where it's like they're just clearly not meaning to actually pay out these things to, like, if you just look at the age compared to the times that, or the life expectancy when they're setting these ages, it's like they're trying to pay out as little as possible and trying to get the most labor out of people possible in a way that's it's just too transparent and obvious now that they're just exploiting Americans' inability to do math is what it comes down to.
What's not often broadcast, and I think it should be broadcast on a daily basis, there should be a ticker in mass media. There should be a ticker on any kind of public news station about the time remaining before the cash reserves of the Social Security benefits run out for 100% distributions upon eligibility for Social Security benefits. Because right now, I believe those benefits are going, the 100% distribution of the benefits and the cash reserves are going to run out by around 2034. And it'll be 79% distribution until 2090 after that point, if Congress decides to make the necessary adjustments.
Well, and that's again, when our GDP is 14 trillion and then our Social Security cash reserves are something like 3 trillion. Is that actually a whole lot of cash reserve? You know, we're dealing with people who've just perpetually been bad at math in a way that gives us these situations where our infrastructure is falling apart, our population is aging. They're living longer, but now we have our government just basically throwing them to the COVID wolves, and at the same time, there's no real capacity for Americans to understand what's happening or how to do anything about it, except like, oh, well, vote. And it's like, that doesn't end up actually changing anything because it ends up being the same incentives from both parties at the top. Like, they both have the same incentives where it's just crazy to, you know, all these people who've bought all these guns and to actually stop the government from being fascist, not even understanding what actual fascism is or seeming to care when it comes to fascism against brown people and women.
So
that's like,
we're on the verge of a bunch of evictions and mortgage foreclosure and all that kind of stuff. And from what I'm gleaned in the past few days, you can't vote. You can't mail-in vote if you don't have an address. And you know, your voter registration is tied to an address.
yeah, can you vote at all? I don't know if you can.
I don't
even
think
just
you-
mail in. I don't know if you can.
I don't think you can.
If you have ID, you still have to like have an address to vote. If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, that on its own sets the stage for some really, oh man, just a really terrible situation where people lose their voice because they get evicted because our government fails to recognize an imminent threat of pandemic and doesn't act because they're waiting so they can get the civil unrest to take pages out of the China protest handling playbook. And there's no amount of an economic stimulus that's going to stop the housing crisis from happening. And then that's going to create the situation where our elections are fundamentally flawed because of some rules that were created to protect the wealthy.
Yeah, we're actually seeing the rules that were put in place to entrench white supremacist patriarchy in the government playing out on a large scale. That you know, there's going to be a lot of the demographics that are going to be affected by this coming housing crisis are going to be largely disproportionate against Republicans. And that's kind of why I mean, in that the people who would have voted against Republicans are going to largely represent those disenfranchised, because the way it seems to have played out is when there's when these large million dollar multi-million dollar payments were going out to companies, you're finding that the big companies that are led by white owned white owned organizations are getting them, and it's only few of them are getting actual prison time for uh, what's it called, PPP or SBA fraud, whereas like there's a disproportionate amount of black businesses getting taken down and having people thrown in jail for quote unquote fraud, when it's like, it's funny when you have Theranos and all these other pharmaceutical companies committing fraud, like the Purdue, what is it, Purdue
Pharma.
Yeah, like these people are barely getting held accountable for fraud, and you have these small ass businesses now being run by black people getting, long, I think some cases 10, 13 years for fraud on a program that was just put into place, and they're already finding ways to like start prosecuting black people. And it's like, man, I've seen this show before, so I'm like, I'm not surprised, but it's crazy to see how much the patriarchal white supremacist rules in our United States government are now so transparently playing out in a way that, I don't understand why anybody who's not a white male would want this shit to keep going in the way, like, yeah, I don't want the Electoral College. I don't want the Democratic or Republican Party. I don't want anything associated with how this government was set up to perpetuate forward. We need a goddamn entirely new constitution, because that bullshit was meant to like hide slavery. That's all the Constitution was doing, is just hiding it. Like in language where you're like, oh, all humans were created equal, invisible parentheses, except these niggas and these Indians. And it's like, or the women for that matter. And it's like those invisible parentheses are still fucking there. We act like this Constitution is for us. It ain't for us. That ain't for you, Tien. That ain't for you, Daniel. Neither one. That shit ain't for either one of y'all. It ain't for me. It ain't for none of us. It ain't for the women in our family. That shit ain't for none of us. So we need to stop acting like these goddamn racist ass forefathers knew anything about fucking equality. They knew about hiding fucking oppression in language. That's what the fuck they knew about, some double speak and new think and hiding that shit to the point where we're talking about fucking minority protection and black, indigenous people of color, but we're still fighting in a goddamn constitutional system that's built against us from the very fucking beginning. So we'll never be first class citizens in this shit. Not with this Constitution, not with any of these fucking amendments, not with a goddamn one of them. Never.
So you bring up an excellent set of points, especially in regards to the efficacy of people trying to affect change within the government itself. People may have dreams or aspirations or motivations to change a system from the inside, or they may not. Maybe they fully understand that it's a system designed to fundamentally exploit people, and they want to get into a position where they can make those exploits and get the information and power necessary for them to rise in status and accrue wealth and security over the long term. Because I think anybody who honestly goes into a political career really trying to protect their communities or trying to enhance the social safety net, or to make things more equitably distributed in terms of wealth and attention, and reduce the opportunities for disenfranchisement of certain populations that are underprivileged and intentionally have been put into a position of devaluation, regardless of how level they are in regards to everybody else for being able to contribute. Because obviously it's a farce. It's fallacious to believe that just because somebody looks different or just because somebody came from a different place, that they're not able to contribute on the same level as somebody who happens to control the system. So as soon as somebody enters that system and they try to make a change, I think they're either corrupted or they find quickly that they either have to integrate themselves into the system and basically try and survive.
Well, it's just like they changed the rules to allow for discrimination in housing now. And then this fucking president Nazi tweeted about, oh, if you live in a rich neighbor or wealthy neighborhood, you don't have to worry about low income housing being placed in your neighborhood now. It's like, oh, why the fuck would I want to own property in this bullshit ass country then? This is the fucking shithole country, man. This is the fucking Nazi run country. Why the fuck am I, as a black person, even thinking about owning property in this bullshit? Because then that just reinforces the notion that I'm a second class citizen and have to pay to get put in a fucking neighborhood with criminals that happen to be black, because these fucking people are trying to like dictate property value by race rather than actual assessment of property value. So this is low key redlining happening again. And then people are like, why don't you own a home? It's because I'm fucking black and I don't want to pay for my own subjugation, motherfucker. I ain't trying to be a second class citizen and pay for that shit. Hell no. If I ever own land, it ain't gonna be in no fucking white patriarchal ass system. Fuck all that. Hell no.
Yeah, I think this is one of those scenarios where I keep thinking, it's like, man, what do I got to do to what do I have to do to come up with enough capital to completely move operations to, like, we've talked about Mauritius in the past, because Mauritius seems to be a very open-minded, tech-rich environment, very progressive, very modern. And how do we move our operations there? What do we have to do to get that to happen? Because I feel like that would be a good end game or a good end goal.
I've looked at, going to vast different countries, and what it always boils down to is paying some ridiculous amount of money because nobody wants us. Nobody want no fucking Americans. And the reason they don't want us is because Americans throw off economies. If you have a local population of workers that has the skills, and then you have some dumbass American waltzing in that bought their fucking degree and then is gonna like fake their way all the way through and get paid more than the locals through, that throws off all the economies around the world. So now guess what? Everybody's wise to that shit, so they don't want us, and it costs a lot of money. Or in most places to immigrate, there literally has to be a lack of people in the work position that you're trying to move for. Otherwise, you're not going to get a fucking work visa to go like damn near anywhere. And
Yeah.
that's the craziest shit, where I'm like doing all the research. I'm like, oh fuck, we're stuck here. We have no we have no real mobility as non-wealthy people. Like, the rich people can expatriate and then pretend they fucking did it for some reason that had nothing to do with them just being able to buy their way into some different country, and then act like they were self-made and built some new life and all this bullshit, and then have a media write a movie about it, and then all these poor people feel bad about themselves because they can't figure out how to get out of America, when in reality it comes back to that social security number. Because guess what? We're all fucking prisoners here, and that wall is meant to keep us in and keep us working. It's not meant to fucking keep Mexicans out.
Yeah.
It's meant to keep Americans in, putting that fucking wage labor in on the fucking plantation that this country is. And we're just too blind to see that shit because our fucking media is so good at propaganda that they've renamed themselves fucking fake news. And now we even forget what the word propaganda means because they're so good at double speak and triple speak now, in a way that now Americans are so convinced that their country is number one, that they haven't even bothered to realize that none of this shit has been updated since 1985. And that's why the fucking bridges are falling apart. That's why trains are falling off fucking bridges, causing destructive events that could have resulted in people dying. That shit just happens now because our shit is just we're just used to it falling apart because capitalism has trained us to have low ass standards, super low ass standards. America is a Rob Schneider film
You
right
know,
now.
when I was in high school, I remember reading about China's development of the bullet trains and how they were having significant issues, and like, train crashes, derailment, things like that, things that we're having right now. And I remember people talking about how, bless our good old fashioned American train system, tough and reliable. And meanwhile, god damn.
Train system only week to get from one coast to the other, maybe a little bit longer. But God bless our train system if it actually works that week.
Yeah, well, in the 20 years since I graduated from high school, China's train system has gone from, trying to figure out how to make it work to being probably the most sophisticated and thoroughly developed train system on the planet. And in that 20 years, our train system has done, well, they've hired a bunch of people who've fallen asleep and killed people.
Exactly right. And I think that in and of itself demonstrates the priorities of the distribution of finances and the propping up of certain industries over others. Basically, some industries are allowed to enter a state of prolonged dilapidation and degradation, and then others that make people money in the short term are given the most attention. And I think it's important, and we've discussed it on the show before, to give some time to discussing how the military industrial complex siphons away so many resources from things like public works, transportation, the development of various technologies in order to produce substandard or maintain the production of substandard equipment, or siphon away funds and then leave people in combat situations with lacking situations or unfit equipment for their determined purposes. Because why do we still rely on conventional firearms or things like guns? Using compressed gas to launch metal across a short distance. Why aren't we using all of these resources instead of continuing to mass produce those particular items? Why haven't we come up with something else, or why haven't we used that to increase or enhance the other industrial applications of certain technologies, instead of trying to find a better way to fire metal at a compressed rate? Why don't we try and figure out how to concentrate energy in a particular way, or allow people to live more safely without having to rely on those types of weapons and technologies?
It's crazy that in America, if you're just what you're just asking is basically, why aren't we taking money and not investing it in killing in things that aren't focused on killing people? In America, anything remotely close to that framing is socialist. And then meant to be framed as if that's somehow negative. In all of these things where you end up looking at the way the language has been worked and built to oppress people and subjugate through the actual construction of the language, is one of the reasons I just have a deep disdain for English as a language. And I'm glad I speak French, but I hate English to my core, in that it's one of those things that when you realize how much it like, oh, it only gives you the capacity to see things in a singular lens. Once you break yourself from that like limitation, it's infuriating that the language exists. It pisses me off that this language even fucking exists. And I really, really hate the English language itself for all of the things that it does to brown people and women in its latent subjugation that is all there, down to when you have people talking about master bedrooms. Yeah, fuck master bedrooms. It sounds like super innocuous, but fuck master bedrooms. You know what I mean? And that's, again, it's like one of these things that people don't even think about that shit because it's so common in our fucking language that everything is broken down to make black people especially look bad and make everything black negative. There's nothing damn near black that's positive in the fucking English language. And it's one of those things that when you think about it, wow, I never really thought about that. If you're black, that's the shit that you constantly have to think about growing up. It's like, why is everything black that's bad? Why is blackmail, black this, black that, black sheep? Everything that's black is bad. And you're a kid and you're made to feel as if you're the one that's a snowflake for fucking thinking about that concept, not realizing, yeah, that shit's there. That shit's there. It's not just you as a black person. It's not just you as a dark-skinned person. Oh, the dark meat's bad. You want the white meat. Why is that? Why is that a thing?
In China, they like the dark meat because it's more tender and it's moist and it can cook longer, can take higher heat.
That doesn't equal death there either. I'm pretty sure, right?
No, not at all.
And it's like white isn't pure either. It's like I think white, or it's either white or red or some shit that's death, and black is not this negative, and it's not even like a bad death when they're talking about. So there's all these things when we're talking about the word and the connotations with black that then force me as a black person to then have to shed off all of the negative connotations with that the language is built in to see myself through, to then understand that I don't have to see black as bad because that's what the language is trying to train me to do, and understanding that then black had pre-existed fucking English, so I don't have to let English define black for me. So I'm not about to let English define black for me. Fuck that. Or female or male or any of these concepts that English does such a terrible job at defining, because China, it's meant to occlude these concepts and make them hard for us to grasp. So then we think of them in the most simplistic ways possible in just black and white. It just reduces everything to black and white.
In China, during a funeral, I think they wear white. And at weddings, they wear red because red is associated with success and prosperity and strength. And the last wedding I attended, I remember seeing a woman wearing a red silk dress, a Chinese dress, but she wasn't the bride. And one of the weddings I attended before that, I saw a gentleman wearing a white silk shirt, a Chinese shirt. And I thought it was interesting because, man, when American culture gets it wrong, it just like, I mean, women aren't supposed to wear a wedding dress to somebody else's wedding. And I mean, I used to joke about how I would wear the same thing to weddings and funerals because to me they were kind of the same thing, but I wouldn't actually wear funeral attire to a wedding.
Well, English is a highly contextual language.
Yeah.
And what you and Chris have brought up is the cultural differences in understanding and being educated about the context upon which social interactions on a broad scale are established and founded. So there's the context of what the term black or blackness means and how it's regarded in by certain cultures, and there are obviously different considerations of the context, and people have to be conscious of the context, or they're raised not to be conscious of the context and simply accept it. But that indicates privilege, and that also indicates the potential for implicit bias. And I think there needs to be a greater understanding or a broader understanding of abstraction and of the dynamism of poetry in the English language in order to establish a broader contextual understanding and the willingness to accept the potential that a context can be faulty and that a context can be biased or it can be harmful. And it also helps to speak a different language. It helps any language, a language that English has roots in or relation to, and then other languages that English does not have any real connection to. English is very much, it can be considered very much a polyglot language, or just a combination of words and sounds that are derived from other languages, and it tries to make things up as it goes along. And that's where we get a lot of our colloquialisms, and that's why a lot of colloquialisms can become quite dated. Whereas there are some languages, for instance, Hebrew, which is quite an ancient language, and it has its own poetic structures and frameworks and means of expression. It has its own way of defining context. But if when I listen to people who speak Hebrew as their first language, and then who learn English as a second language, they tend to have a different understanding of how context can be used in order to describe their ideas and their concepts and interact with other people.
Right. Yeah. And it's not just going to be Hebrew. There's other language variations that result in the same sort of different perspective about framing ideas. In that's why one of the reasons I hate English so much is in this current construction, it's meant to limit idea expression, and that's kind of why you end up having these cultural moments where you have English speakers and Latin speakers coexisting, which still happens in the context of a church, in that there are going to be concepts in English or in Latin that you can't grasp unless you understand Latin, because English is not capable of accurately describing those idea frameworks. And this one of the things that was always interesting to me about Hebrew, conceptually, in the terms of having mathematical counterparts in the language, because I think Arabic does that as well. I don't think there's like multiple languages that have math counterparts in their characters, and what that does is it creates this capacity for the language to be its own Rosetta Stone, in that Hebrew was like a dead language for, I think, 1,600 years or so in like the Western context. Like there's still people who spoke, I believe, like Amharic, which is like the language of like the main language of Ethiopia today, which is a Semitic language that is like a combination of Ethiopian and Hebrew. There's something like there's like a lot of languages that we're not really taught about in America, because once you learn about there's like a meme that goes around ever so often that shows different concepts in different languages that have words for them that we don't have in English, that express different ideas. Schadenfreude is or Schadenfreude is, I forget the exact spelling off the top of my head, but anybody can look it up. It's like the notion of
it looks like Schadenfreude.
Yeah, it's Schadenfreude. But it's the notion of taking joy in someone else's displeasure. Like we don't have a word for that in English that's specifically that feeling, so we adopted it into English. So it becomes what's known as a cognate, in that when you adopt something into a language and keep the original language's pronunciation or spelling, then that's when you have cognates, which don't necessarily happen in all languages, because you have like languages like French that will then say we need to have our own French word for this, and they have an actual bureau of people come together and decide, okay, English speaking people invented this word computer, what is going to be the French word for it? And they create ordinateur. And so you don't say computer in French, it's ordinateur. They don't use the word computer because they created their own. So there's all these things about language that when you have the understanding of the construction being something that is done with intention, then you see the rules and the definitions and the word structures themselves have meanings in a way that are not going to be innocuous when you break them down. So it's not something that just happens 100% organically at the top, but on the ground level, as Daniel was speaking about, it's almost 100% organic in that when you have people using colloquialisms, that's when you start to get new words, new constructions, and then sometimes you have people at high levels using colloquialisms that end up redefining words. So a great example is George W. When he kept saying nuclear, incorrectly saying nuclear, they ended up creating nuclear as a colloquial variation on the word nuclear because so many people would not correct him word in public that it became a colloquial variation. So that's kind of when you have that shit happen when people are like, oh, I can't say nuclear and I say nuclear. Well, sometimes that shit ends up becoming an actual word because people are too lazy to look up the actual fucking pronunciation. And this is like one of the things I often hate about English speakers because they never get pronunciations right habitually and they do that shit with foreign people on purpose. So there's a lot of shit that a lot of reasons why I hate English.
Absolutely. And English can be a very frustrating language, especially for people who come from other countries to try and learn how to speak it. And then not to mention all of the flack that they get from typically ignorant native English speakers for their attempts to speak English, which is in and of itself a strange language, but not nearly as complex, evolved, or has a storied history as the languages that other people may speak naturally. I mean, people may be able to communicate in English at a pretty high level, but then also speak 2 or 3 other languages and learn English third. But just because they have an accent, they're not given the benefit of the doubt in regards to how they pronounce certain things, even though they're able to convey ideas at a much higher level than people who have spoken English as a primary language their whole lives. Also, to just qualify the statement about Hebrew being a dead language, it wasn't exactly dead in terms of any kind of use. It was dead in the terms of, I think it was just not widely used in public discourse within certain Western societies. But as long as Judaism was practiced, it was used within the various Jewish communities of the diaspora.
Right.
It was revived as a popular language and a more national identity-based language with the, I think it was like in the late 1800s is when that started.
Well, and I was going to say that the whole reason I said in the West is because Jewish immigration and expansion into the Western hemisphere just hadn't started like until the 1800s on large scale. So it's like, yeah, it's basically dead in the West, and it's not dead altogether. And that's why I made that. The Western simplification likes to make it as if it was completely dead, but that's just absolutely not true.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's, again, it's one of these things that when you learn about the Hebrew history from white people, they leave a lot of shit out, and it becomes one of these things where, again, it's like it's the same shit with other countries' histories. They like to make it as if Western historians save cultures from their own destruction. Same thing with Lakota and Native American cultures recording their histories. Like you have the Europeans coming in and destroying their histories and killing the people that keep track of their history, and then trying to frame it as if Western projects to save their history is what actually is preserving Native American culture, instead of actually the fact that it's, obviously the natives don't need anybody to save them. It's just, they just need people not to be destroying their culture actively.
Absolutely. I mean, there's recorded history for centuries, if not greater than that, of European and ancestral European civilizations just basically massacring Jewish populations for opportunistic reasons and then rewriting history to justify it or to indicate that the Jewish population was better off for whatever happened.
And that's, it's crazy in that this whole um period is sort of occluded in American history because you can't really they sort of teach it, but they don't teach it right in that if you don't understand the origins of ghettos in America, then you're going to not understand um, how Jewish communities proliferated and why they are geographically distributed in the same way that Chinese communities are geographically distributed. There's a reason there's Chinatowns and all the, and um, clumps of immigrants in different areas. It's because at certain periods in history, there were massive movements for certain reasons to different areas. And that's where, like, for example, like the ghettos in New York that used to be almost all Jewish and then Irish immigrants at certain points. Then once those communities started gaining wealth and moving out of those places, then they were replaced by black disenfranchised communities that were then put there because of white flight. There's all these things that happen in community movement that happen because of racism, because of policing, um, and then because of certain communities having worked for decades or at certain points almost centuries to build communal wealth, and then them transitioning out of poverty as a community while other communities are transitioning into poverty, and it looks like they have something to do with each other, but they really have nothing to do with each other in certain cases, where it's like Jewish movement out of poverty has nothing to do with black movement into poverty, but that's not the same for Irish immigrants in that there's a whole lot of Irish immigrant policing of black communities in the early 1900s that led to Irish immigrants gaining wealth and status that this is like known as when the Irish became white, because effectively a lot of Irish were seen as black. And this is when you get back to people talking about, oh, Irish people used to be slaves too. Well, technically, if you're going to pull that argument, that's when they were not seen as white. So there's this whole thing about, if you don't understand how history has played out, then you're going to hear certain things and it's going to seem contradictory or going to seem to undermine other things, but you have to get the full context of those things to truly understand what was happening. And then you're not obviously going to understand 100%, but this is where, again, American English actively works to occlude these understandings from people to say, why is Irish slavery not the same as African chattel slavery that was imposed on Africans by Europeans, because Africans didn't originally have chattel slavery? It's this weird, if you can't, some people are only going to understand what I just said, where they're like, what is chattel slavery compared to indentured servitude? If you don't know those things, you have to go look them up. And in American English, one of the biggest problems is that if you don't know a word, you are encouraged to guess that word contextually rather than to go look it up. Repeatedly throughout the years, many, many people encourage Americans to guess through context rather than to actually just go look up the fucking word. And that's some American ass shit that you don't get everywhere else.
Well, also there's blatant omissions of sheer brutality by certain regimes or movements of people or organizations of people, largely white in the historical setting, ranging from anywhere from 1000 AD to the President Andrew Jackson. So there's never the discussion of, so there usually it comes along the lines of, at least in public American education, it's like, here we had an event called the Crusades, and it was fought for XYZ reason, and the Europeans came and they fought, and then the Muslim population fought, and then they left for a while, and then they came back, and there was a second crusade, and then there was a third crusade. And basically it's just taught in terms of fighting, but it's never like, okay. And then there was this population that was just massacred along the way, and then all these other people were massacred along the way. That typically is omitted.
I'm fairly positive white did not exist as a construct when the Crusades started. So that's kind of why it's like when we're talking about Europeans, we're talking about tribes and the proto nation states that are then accumulations of tribes that white has not emerged as a concept yet. So that's why it's like even still dangerous. Like there is like Negro, there's things that emerge to start like articulating the difference between dark-skinned people and light-skinned people. But the actual concept of white as we know it, I don't think actually emerged until the 1400s. And everything before that was mostly tribal or associated with nobility. And it was like the purity of your bloodline had to do with your family name, not to do with whiteness, which is where that whole bastardization of family blood purity is now just conflated with white purity, which again, as a concept, only emerged in the 1400s. So again, that's why it's like, when we're talking about the development of, this is why it's important to understand the development of nation states and the concept of developing identities, to understand how when you have a nation state that is no longer homogenous in its genetic makeup, if there ever was one, then you have to develop sub identities that go beyond states to then develop these, white or black identities to then call to action people within those communities without calling, in the same way when you had people in World War I who were black under Jim Crow laws fighting in Europe to liberate people while they have to go home and be fucking subjugated and spit at. World War II, they're going to liberate Jews, still under fucking Jim Crow, still second-class citizens, but they have to go fight because they get drafted. If you don't fucking respond to the draft, you go to prison. So these people are basically slave mercenaries that then are used to liberate people, and then we get call the white people the greatest generation.
So in there's a modern categorization, and it's from the 1800s, late 1800s, and so you have Ethiopian for black, Caucasian or white, Mongolian or yellow, American or red, and Malayan or brown.
Well, and they used to even call it Mongoloid.
Yeah.
Straight up Mongoloid. These are not the most intelligent people. They're just playing science. Which again, a lot of the actual race, quote unquote, science happens around the same time as dog breeding emerges. And that's why, like, when you look at how race is being created as a construct and how dog breeding is occurring around the same time, that's why it's like, this shit is relatively recent in terms of human history, and everything before that really was not, like I said, it was not really around these racial lines, but they try to make it seem like it was. Because otherwise this construct, like, is stupid if you realize how recent it was added on. Because then, they take into account with science, obviously there's co-dominance within genetics. So it's like there's no such thing as like a dominant race. And then if anything, like these people who are claiming like, oh, white supremacy, it's like, no, that's not what the genetics have to say at all. It's like anytime these European genes are introduced with anything else, they become recessive. So that's like, genetics don't even align with their the principles, and that's why it's like, when you
isn't that part of the illusion they're trying to sell?
Right, yeah. Well, again, Hitler was not blonde or did not have blue eyes. He was Austrian. Fucking, brunette Austrian.
Carolus Linnaeus in the 18th century, he was a Swedish naturalist, and he was among the first scientists to provide a categorization for human beings, at least recorded, and he divided them into species within the animal kingdom.
Species.
And that, yes. So he said that, but he regarded humanity as a species within the animal kingdom. And he had them divided into subgroups of European, American, Asiatic, and African.
So then, have you then done the cross research on the dog breeding then? Again, but like I don't think people realize how recent these constructs are. They are not old constructs at all. Like this shit, race had nothing to do with the Crusades. Like race didn't even exist during the Crusades.
It was a predominantly religiously motivated and also financially motivated.
What the fuck is wrong with people?
Black fucking Vikings, you know? And it's like, there's like the idea that all these Vikings were Norse, blonde-haired, blue-eyed people. That shit ain't true either. Because that shit, they weren't thinking of themselves as white people. They were Vikings that took oaths and shit. And again, this whole construct of racial purity based on genetic lineage and DNA is so recent. It's crazy how recent that shit is in actual terms of delineating associations in human history. But again, this construct they're gonna make it seem like this shit is as old as civilization.
Well, it's because it serves the purposes of the people who create a majority of the material that people learn from for profit.
Yeah, for sure. And again, that's the crazy, you know, science has already asserted that race doesn't really exist. And it's only really a paradigm that's in the context of this period in cultural history. So yeah, we scientifically know race doesn't exist. So all the scientists know that. What we have to do is then get out of a period where half the people in a certain country still believe wholeheartedly that not only does it exist, that their McDNA is superior to other people's DNA, and that
I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, that perspective lends itself to implicit bias within medical treatment as well. I mean, believing, you know, that just because if somebody truly believes that race exists and they buy into the fallacy around what the implications of a certain race carry with them, then that also affects the way that, I mean, it's been documented that there is implicit racial bias in how certain doctors treat patients based off of their perceived race.
Yeah, and Black women suffer the most because of this bias. And that's one of those things that, you know, you'll have a Black woman having a heart attack and the doctor's telling her that she's not in pain because there's this implicit bias that Black women specifically fake their pain for whatever reason. So then the doctors don't treat them. And that's like a real thing. So, you know, when we have quote unquote medical professionals who end up with this racial bias because we don't have a system that is willing to acknowledge its own bias to then put people in positions of being empowered to be women of color that are helping other women of color, because then the idea of a male gynecologist is just fucking stupid. The fact that you have a male gynecologist in any context is stupid. There should be a program that takes women and makes them gynecologists and pays for that shit. So we don't have any fucking male gynecologists in this country. We don't need any people who don't have vaginas discussing vaginal health or assessing vaginal health, period. In 2020 moving forward, we just don't need that, because that's something that our dumbass system made us okay with because it didn't allow us the capacity to step back and say, hey, what does this dude never had a fucking vagina in his life going to know about vaginal health from a fucking book or a video or a YouTube link, whatever? You can't learn about a fucking vagina if you don't have a vagina to understand how to give someone advice on vaginal health. I'm sorry. In 2020, I don't accept that paradigm. I don't care how long the fucking man has been doing it. If he's doing it for 20 years, he still doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about because he doesn't have a fucking vagina. Can he tell me what this feels like? Can he tell me what X, Y, Z feels like? No, he can't. He can describe it from someone else's description, but he can't tell me what that shit feels like himself. So he doesn't need to be telling other fucking women with vaginas how to handle their fucking vaginas in 2020 and moving forward. We accepted that shit because we were stuck in a patriarchal system that made us okay with that before. We don't have to keep being okay with male gynecologists
You
in
know,
2020.
the only time I've ever had a bad steak or a bad chicken was when I went to a place where the cook wasn't a person that ate meat. It was always somebody who that just wasn't their thing. They didn't like it. They didn't eat it. They've never eaten it before. And so they never developed that kind of sense or skill to know when it's ready. I think the whole thing, the situation holds true in other situations.
I mean, I don't want a woman examining my prostate either. She doesn't know what the fuck it feels like. Again, it's just this thing of there is this element of trying to be too politically correct and then doing things that don't make any sense. Like if you don't have a fucking prostate, you don't know what that shit feels like.
Yeah.
So I'm not gonna take your word if I tell you I'm having this prostate problem and you don't have a prostate. I can't take that person knows what this shit feels like or even remotely can fathom what that feels like. And then they're gonna tell me some fucking advice based on some shit that they read in a book. That's bullshit. That's absolute bullshit in 2020. There's no reason that we should accept. I mean, again, it's not to say that every person who operates on a disabled person has to be disabled. Obviously, there's like only certain points, but that person should be consulting disabled people before they do anything, not just the person they're operating on at the time, but they need to be in constant conversation with the community they're serving then. And that's where it's like, yeah, you could say that about a male gynecologist, but there's too many fucking qualified women to have male gynecologists. There's just no reason. They're just not put in a position where they can do that and not end up $100,000 in debt or $300,000 in debt or something stupid, so that then they don't make the decision to do that. And that's where I'm saying, like, I refuse to accept in 2020 that we need male gynecologists or women checking prostates. Like, we just don't need that. That's something, it's like, it's not meant to be politically correct. It's meant to say, as a society, we have these things that are directly contributing to exploitation and abuse because of the disparity. Like, it's like, why would you even think that allowing a heterosexual man to look at vaginas as his job would be okay? That's not okay on any fucking planet. I don't care what year you were born on, what year you were born in. That is not okay. And the idea that our country is trying to train us to think, oh yeah, male OBGYNs, normal. That's completely normal.
$500,000.
Guess what Dr. Cliff Huxtable was?
A rapist?
Is his profession on the show.
Oh. Wait.
He was a gynecologist, right?
Yeah. So the one that they were trying to fucking get us comfortable with, what the fuck was he doing in real life? Fuck. Shit. This is the gynecologist they tried to make us comfortable with. Just happens to be this dude. Shit. Well, why didn't we see that shit coming? Because we were being made comfortable to have this dude fucking seeing women in his home office. Really? You have a gynecologist seeing women in his home office as a plot for a kid's show? Okay. That's fucked.
So,
because step back and look at it, that's what the fuck it was.
It's really expensive to become a OBGYN. In addition to the 4 years of college, and that's if the person manages to complete their program in 4 years for undergrad. That's like, average about $50,000 a year. So that's $200,000 right off the bat. and then figuring another $80,000 a year for med school, and that could be 4 to 7 years, plus your residency, and you might get paid for some of that, but it's not going to be like big doctor money. So we're already up to 500,000 to 600, almost $700,000.
Yeah, and again,
That's like 20 years making 35 grand a year for people who have, entry level or basic jobs that don't go anywhere. 20
Yep.
years. Ugh.
And it's this system where then if that same person wanted to go kill brown people, government will pay you to do that shit.
Oh yeah, and they'll give you a signing bonus. So if you decide to go do a second tour, you might get another $100,000.
You want to go to school to learn how to kill brown people better? They'll pay for your degree.
They'll give you $1,000 worth of equipment just to carry around, and that's before you ever set foot on a battlefield.
Then this person wants to help people. Here's a loan with some terrible ass interest rates.
This is America.
Yeah,
that's where you end up with situations like I have a friend who's struggled with weight his entire life, and he would relate to me stories of he would visit the doctor. Now this friend of mine, he worked out fanatically, and he really stuck to very strict dietary guidelines in his daily life, and he always struggled with weight, and he would go to various doctors or general practitioners, and he would say to them, I'm struggling with my weight, and they would say, oh, well, you just have to diet or you have to work out more. And he said, I did all this stuff, and they just wouldn't believe him. So
yeah, it's really difficult to get doctors to believe you. That's why the people don't like going to them, man.
Well, of course, doctors know everything. They can just look at a piece of paper and know everything about you. Asses.
Yeah, I went, I had they found out it was like a kidney infection. And I was like in there and I was saying I couldn't sleep and I couldn't lay down and I couldn't sit. So I was in this spot where I'm like, oh my God, I'm in the worst pain I've ever felt like in my life, like legitimately. And this doctor is just looking at me like I'm fucking making this shit up. No painkiller. They gave me some antibiotic, but I ended up having to take Benadryl to fall asleep because they just would not acknowledge that my pain. Like I fucking hate painkillers, but this was one time where I was like willing to take something to go so I could just fucking go to sleep because when I would try to lay in bed, my back and I guess what it was apparently my kidneys hurt so much that I couldn't lay still. And that was like one of the most stressful and traumatizing experiences because not only did I have to just sit through the pain, like the doctor just refused to believe me and was assuming that I was doing it to get some fucking drugs or some bullshit. And that's like, it's the most dehumanizing thing when somebody thinks that you're faking your pain to get drugs. And on top of that, if that was even the case, and I'm like dope sick, and I need drugs, and you're a fucking doctor, that doctor is inhumane on so many levels, man. It's so crazy that, when I was in that position, they just treated me like I was trying to fucking scam them and then end up paying for fucking drugs. Like I wasn't gonna be able to get that shit for free. I was gonna have to pay for it somehow. So they're trying to make it seem like the person coming in saying they're in pain is just an actor. I'm a really good actor trying to get some fucking drugs. And then they're like, oh shit, yeah, you've got blood in your urine. Sorry, we're going to give you some antibiotics because you're actually sick. You weren't making this up, even though when we're sitting here looking at you, I'm giving you this real skeptical look, breathing my funky ass breath in your face. The dude burped in my fucking face, man. I never that shit because I wanted to punch him. I wanted to punch the doctor because he fucking burped in my face. And I just remember being like, God damn it, if I was not sick right now I obviously wouldn't be there, but if I was getting a regular checkup and somebody burped in my face, didn't cover that shit up, I would have jumped off that table and fucking lifted him up and looked at him and said, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" Like, but this is a doctor who's treating me, who I'm paying for their service, burping in my fucking face as if I'm not there.
There should
Not
be.
even to say excuse me.
Well, that's just not right. That's
That's
like
what that, but that's like being that's being a patient in 20 or whatever it was, 20, probably 15. Um, but again, that's where I'm saying, like, whenever that shit happened, like, man, I've never been so livid in my life to just want to throw somebody, but in a position where I'm at their fucking mercy, because this is supposed to be my doctor, the person that took a fucking Hippocratic oath to help me when I'm in pain, but he sees a black man trying to scam him for some fucking painkillers. So he can't even take me seriously. And that's this system. And that's why I'm not trying to fucking buy a house here.
I think that I have a theory, and I could be really wrong, but I think that there are a lot of people who grew up wanting to be doctors, and our system encourages people to pursue their dreams. And at some point, the academic system of filtration failed, and it allowed people through because they can afford to go to school, and these people wanted to be the superstar brain surgeon or the superstar plastic surgeon or the superstar oncologist, whatever. But they didn't actually have the aptitude for that, and so they end up working as a what amounts to a really highly paid secretary for the actual doctor. And they take their notes, and they might do a little bit of examination, but they're not the person they're not the person whose name is on the practice.
I don't know if I buy that, in that working on a doctorate, you basically have to get, like, you can't get a C and get your doctorate. Like, that's not gonna happen with the, like,
Oh, no, I mean they can become a
of,
doctor. They're
of course they pay for it. But what I'm saying is, I don't know if if somebody's able to pay for what it takes to become a doctor. That's a whole lot of theater. Like, not to say
No,
like that the
I mean that they like didn't excel during their residency, and so they're not actually surgeons. They're a doctor, but
yeah.
they're never going to be a surgeon.
I mean, yeah, I think that's
That's what I'm
definitely.
getting at. That I'm not talking about academic doctors. I'm talking about, medical degree holding doctors who don't
Well,
have
the whole reason I said the academic is to give that example, and that they won't let you get a doctorate
yeah.
as an academic doctor with a C, like, let alone a medical doctor. So I'm saying, like, if a medical doctor is getting through, they're at least paying for the fucking grade then. And if somebody's going through that trouble to pay for the grades, and then, as you pointed out, it's going to be like $250,000, if not more, to get that. It's like, that person, I don't even know if there's that, like, it's a weird intersection of motivation to want to please people but also not do the work, and having that much money, that I feel like that person is like, they'd be more likely to just be wasting their fucking inheritance in a pool somewhere rather than trying to play doctor. Like, the intersection is just like, it's too much actual work to pull off that facade.
No, I mean they're by paying for it. I mean they're paying for it in terms of being able to actually get through the whole program. They're uh, they're not suffering under loans that are going to just completely strangle them. They can do it. Sure, they can do it, but they're not the superstar. They're never going to be the superstar. They're good enough to hold the degree. They're good enough to be a doctor. They're just not surgeons. They don't have that part in them. They're good doctors, but they're not like talented surgeons. And now those things exist. I've met plenty of doctors who weren't surgeons. They got through medical school. They knew all this stuff.
I just don't know if this paradigm works in medicine, because when you have, like, surgery, it's not just one surgeon. It's like a team of
I
surgeons,
know.
because this shit, like, lasts 10 hours. So it's like, yeah, there's a head surgeon, but, like, if you're doing some shit that's going to be like a 14-hour surgery, you can't do that shit by yourself.
Of
And
course
we're
not.
we're again, we're in this like paradigm that's trying to be like, oh, Professor or Dr. Adam Strange or whatever the dude's name was, like, this is the superstar, but in reality, like, that does not how it works in surgery rooms. Like,
Yeah, well, what I mean is that there are doctors who will examine your back who will never ever enter an operating room. They'll never have that. They'll never be that person. At best, they're the secretary for the guy whose practice they work at,
oh,
and
for sure. And
and
I
that's what
mean,
I'm getting at. There are a lot of people with degrees, medical degrees, who can write prescriptions, who can examine you, who can tell you all the things based on your chart, but they don't actually. They shouldn't actually be there. These
yeah.
are the people who jump to the conclusion that you're just looking for drugs, or when somebody asks for a plan for to taper off the months of medication that some quack has been prescribing them, they dismiss them as seeking drugs. Or when somebody shows up with an old injury that's always reoccurring because the doctors just wouldn't fix it because the person didn't have the money, they assume it's because they want drugs, and that happens. Those are all
That's,
real situations.
I think that's a lack of empathy more than a lack of aptitude, and that's why I don't want to like conflate the two. In that, I in my, not to say that people can't slip through. I just don't think it's that possible for that demographic of person to really exist in medicine. In that, like, if you have like physical tremors, like, yeah, you're never gonna become a surgeon. Like, if you don't have 100% steady hand, on no planet will you ever become a surgeon. Like, no matter what you can learn. So I'm not saying there. Of course, there's like limitations to people's aptitude that become their capacity or their limitation to move up. So I'm not trying to like say you're wrong on that at all. But my thing is like the doctor who is dismissing people because he's racist. I don't think that person has a lack of aptitude. I think that person has a lack of empathy, and I don't want those two things to be like conflated. In that there's like um people with no aptitude, and there's the lack of capacity to execute, and then there's people who have the aptitude but are unwilling to apply that aptitude because they don't care. And that's what I think that is, rather than the person who doesn't have the capacity. Because if a white person came in and had the same ailment, they would have just got different treatment because that doctor cares about them differently. Not to say that again, that's possible they just didn't have the aptitude, but I don't think that's what that is when that shit happens to people that look like me and or women. Because ultimately there's tests to keep that doctor from getting there. Like, there's just too many tests. And again, yeah, they can pay for it, but a lot of this stuff has to be, demonstrated where they work through this shit to be like, yeah, if you paid for somebody to do this stuff, we're gonna figure out by doing a working exam if you actually know what you're talking about, or if you just paid somebody to fill in the write-in part. Because that's where, again, these degrees don't just come with writing exams. They have working hours and, in situations where they do have to do residencies to get their actual degree, or they're assisting in a residency. And if you can't pay somebody to do that shit.
Yeah,
And that's what
when I say pay for it, I mean they have enough money so that they're not struggling through their
no,
residency.
I know you said that, but what I'm saying is if you go through a
I don't
residency,
think that anyone can
if
actually
you if
pay
you
somebody to
struggle
do that
with
for
residency
them.
time, you're learning. Like, you can't fake your way through a
Yeah.
residency or lose your license.
No,
Like, that's
I don't think that anyone can just like pay somebody else to show up for them and get their degree like that. They have to go, but they're not like, and they have to be in the top half of the class to really to make it through the whole program. But they're
top.
also not at the top like 5% of the
Like
class
top
either.
20 or 30%. It's not even top half. And that's what I'm saying. Like,
Yeah,
to actually get your degree, you can't be in the top half. You have to be in like the top 30%. The
sure.
people
Well, they're
top
not even in the top
40%
25%.
don't pass. The people in the top 50%, they don't pass. Like, it's not the same grade scale as undergraduate. It's not even remotely the same grade scale. And that's why I'm saying, like, you don't pass if you get a 70%. Like, you don't get your degree.
Yeah.
Like, that person just can't get through. You can't go into a residency and just half-ass your way
Man,
through.
I'm telling you, I've met plenty of B minus doctors.
Oh, of course they're B minus doctors,
Like,
but what I'm
and
saying is
that those are the people that I
they become
think that
B
they're.
minus doctors on the spot. They pass the test to prove they're A doctors, or like the B minus or whatever it is to pass. You're just not getting them at their 100% effort because either, as you're saying, some of them don't have it, But in most cases, they're not giving their 100% effort because now they have the proof to say they can do it. So then they don't have to give it because the system doesn't check up on them frequently enough. And if you're a patient that doesn't get that 100%, you don't really have a way to report it. And that's why it's like,
So
again,
in that case, the system still failed to filter those people. That's what I'm getting at. Is at some point the academic process, it might be a really strong filter, but if it doesn't identify the people that are just going to start, phoning it in after they get the piece of paper, then what's the point?
those people are not incapable is my point. Is what
Okay.
I'm saying is they prove they're capable and then don't give the effort because there's no real mechanism to make sure that your doctor is giving 100% effort. Like you can't really go report it without having to then take time off of work to go file a lawsuit, pay a lawyer. There's all these mechanisms in place to make it difficult to actually keep tabs on the doctor. So once they pass the fucking test, then that's when they can start slacking off. It's not like they don't have the aptitude. It's that they got past the point to stop having to prove it. And that's why there's this element of like, I know some industries, they make you update your certifications. I'm sure medicine, like they have to update the certifications every 10 years or something for certain things if you're doing certain parts. Like you can't just become a surgeon where like, especially in something like prosthetics and not have to get some sort of certification ever so often. But then there's like general practitioners who are on a different schedule altogether for their certifications where like maybe once you get a license in a certain state, you're going to have to recertify every 30 years or something. And that certification test is like the lowest level. So there's all these different aspects of the standards that different doctors are held to that then are going to be like, yeah, if you go into, what's it called? Emergency.
Trauma?
Like, no, not trauma, but the like clinic, the emergency clinic that's not an actual like doctor's office. You're going to get the fucking C team because there might even be moonlighting from their actual regular practice. Like they're there to make money because their regular practice doesn't pay them enough. And that's when they're definitely not going to put in 100% effort because the whole reason they're there is because the system's not compensating them well enough in their main occupation or their main practice.
I feel like
so then
that's
moonlight in a follow-up practice that doesn't pay them well enough. So of course they're not going to give 100%. That's
totally a funnel to get the person out of the emergency room into their private practice, though.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. That's a byproduct is then these people have to come up with these fucking schemes to make money in a system that's trying to exploit the doctors on both sides. They're, giving these doctors bullshit loans to then give them, put them in positions where they have to charge ridiculous amounts of money to give profits to the pharmaceutical companies and get their patients hooked to then get that doctor paid finally. And it's, middleman once again.
You can review a doctor on Yelp, but that's hardly accountability. I think one of the reasons why people don't
Yelp doctors.
There's definitely doctor reviews on Yelp for like family doctors or top 10 doctors in this state or top 10 doctors in that state. And, people can use that as a metric for how a doctor treats people, but is that really valid? I mean, one of the reasons why we don't probably hear from we don't see a lot of accountability across the board for the way a doctor would interact with a patient is because there are specific metrics in place that are part of the system that you guys have been discussing up until this point, and it could be very well that it's an ineffectual system for specific demographics and populations, as you've brought up. But there's also the matter of patient privacy that could be used as a justification for not necessarily sharing the details of an interaction with a doctor and a patient that could otherwise be used because if any information is shared, it needs to be for a specific approved study and it needs to be de-identified. But that would also mean that there would need to be some sort of quantifiable satisfaction scale for a specific treatment for a specific condition that would then need to be factored into every other interaction with that particular physician. and I don't know if any resources are being funneled in that direction.
Holy crap! Yelp is the #5 doctor review site on Repugen, which has a top 10 doctor review site list for your healthcare practices and needs and stuff like that. Yelp is #5, right after WebMD, and 2 in front of Google My Business. Facebook is #8. Number 10 is called CareDash. That just sounds like door. Oh man.
What was the one you said?
CareDash.
Huh. Never heard of that.
It just doesn't sound good. When I think of someone dashing, it's like, quick, let's get the fuck out of here.
Well, that kind of mentality drives a lot of cultural interactions in the United States. Everybody's about instant gratification and expediency, and oftentimes they don't know if what they're getting is good or not. They just judge it by how much money they have to spend and how fast they get it.
Yeah, and that's,
I just don't think people should be going to Facebook to find their doctor or their dentist or anything. I mean, I guess you can go to Facebook to find a proctologist if you really want to, but I mean,
I'm kind of surprised it's only at 8. Honestly, like I figured.
Well, I think that there's probably a gap within the medical community with social media management. I think that that's still probably a relatively young thing in terms of the world of physicians.
Wait, what? So what was it? Was it measuring interaction with physicians or where people go to get their information?
Below are the top 10 doctor review sites for healthcare providers listed in no particular order. Oh, it's in no order.
Oh, okay.
So it's just a list. Well, that's even worse.
Like somebody could go on Yelp and say, man, I had this herniated disc, and I usually don't talk about my personal issues for the entire internet to see, but this doctor did a great job with my herniated disc. I think that's the kind of stuff that they could, and they could say 5 stars for a herniated disc interaction, and their bedside manner was fantastic. They can do stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that gives people a better idea of the product they're getting when they go to a certain doctor, but a lot of people are limited by their insurance's decision.
I don't think Google or Facebook or any privately held company that exists to sell the user's data should be involved in rating healthcare provision. That's just
Oof, that just sounds scary.
That's just a conflict of all of the interests all at the same damn time.
Well, and then knowing that those people are mining that data to sell those people advertisements for things that could then make their health worse. It's like, oh my God. Because then sometimes I'll see ads for food where they're not always frequent, but they come at the times when you're susceptible to those ads, and that's where I'm like, if I notice these things, the people that don't notice these things are so susceptible in a way where, there's the strong potential for organizations like Facebook or Google to make deals with pseudo healthcare organizations that exploit vulnerable populations by advertising specific things to them that are going to end up with them having higher blood pressure or potentially resulting in diabetes or, in the same way that when you find out that cigarettes and alcohol ads were disproportionately aimed at Black communities in the 60s and 70s, leading to them having to ban cartoon advertisements associated with cigarettes or alcohol, because of Joe Camel or whatever the fuck dude, like that's name was. Like, yeah, they'll specifically target certain demographics to then exploit them.
So there's this comedian, Eddie Peptone, and they call him the Bitter Buddha. and he has this whole bit about what are they called? Seltzer water, carbonated water, flavored carbonated water beverages. And he describes them as a rumor of flavor, which is kind of amusing. Most of that stuff barely has any flavor at all. I mean, maybe if you drink or if you're used to eating like plain boiled chicken with no salt at the table, like maybe that stuff has a lot of flavor. The other day, my dad and I were talking about a rumor of flavor unrelated to this kind of soft drink, and then I get home and Facebook is sending me this sponsored ad about this stuff called Hint, and it's flavored seltzer water. And it just seems so surreal. Like here we are talking. Here, my dad and I were talking about a rumor of flavor, and then I see this thing called Hint, and it's the same damn thing. It's a hint of flavor.
Did you find out if the company actually exists, or did the ad
Just
amalgamate itself based on your?
there were a dozen or so posts of people who are saying, "Oh, this is the best. I love the way it tastes." But when I clicked on the profile links, it wouldn't take me to their profile. It just took me to my regular feed page.
Whoa, that's why I was wondering, man, because like sometimes I feel like these ads are just constructing themselves out of things that people are saying, and then it's like
some nebulous commercial for something just to keep you looking at Facebook.
But in the same way that when you go to a website to try to make a t-shirt or a mug, it can create a demo version of that and make it seem like you actually printed it. It seems like that's what's happening with a lot of this shit, where it's just taking the words that they're picking up on the microphone and imposing it on t-shirts, or like taking the concepts and putting them together in little animations.
It's an AI private labeling algorithm.
Feels like
it's the capitalist Skynet.
And the thing about it is, Facebook wouldn't have to tell us about building this. They would only let their shareholders know that this is the tool they're using. So this is like,
all they have to do is send the product, and then people will believe that it's been there the whole time.
I mean, they don't even have to make the product. They just have to make fake accounts that say the product they sent it.
No, I mean like if I were to click buy, like then they'd have to send me a can with the word Hint on it to complete to complete the whole process. And
but then
I might be the only person that gets that can.
If you have the right things on the back end, you can just have the label printed.
That's what I mean.
Even down to if somebody orders, he used to order custom nutrition bars.
Yeah.
And I name them and everything, and it's like you get to put your name, the name you want on it and everything. So if they just have that on the back end where they're connecting to those custom companies, yeah, the ad can make it seem like that shit is.
There's a warehouse out there with white cans of flavored soda or flavored soda water, and whatever you're talking about, that's how they determine the label to print on it and put it on there. So they only have to make like 8 labels for that 8-pack of seltzer water.
They only have to make the label once somebody clicks buy, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's what I mean. They print it out whenever someone hits buy, that's when it prints out, and that's when it gets applied to those blank white cans.
That would be so cheap for them to do, and would so much actual product moved. That's why I'm saying if we can conceive of this on a podcast, there's no way that in a book boardroom didn't come up with this, and that's what the shit they're doing. Because it would actually be too easy to make for them not to have done it already. And that's why I'm saying the way the shit unfolds when you're talking, and then you get ads for stuff that looks like it's too real to be true because you were just talking about it. I'm calling bullshit. I'm saying some of the stuff might not even be real, and they're just amalgamating people's words and products and coming up with these fake ads to then, but it's like I said, it's only going to be for shit that they have on their actual back end that they can then custom print and ship out within a reasonable amount of time. Because otherwise the illusion would fall apart immediately. So that's why it's like, oh shit, he's talking about seltzer water. We got that in our database. Hit him with this seltzer water ad and sees if he buys it. If he don't buy it, fuck the seltzer water. We'll move on to something else. Oh shit, he's talking about microphones. Let's hit him with this microphone ad. Oh shit, he didn't buy the microphone. Shit, he's talking about shoes. Because I've been seeing these ads for MLO shoes lately. I'm like, I've never heard of this fucking company. It might not even be real because what I find happens is you get these Chinese shoe factories that are making Nikes. They end up making these knockoff Nikes that then other people come and say, "Oh, this is my brand," and they act like they come up with their own brand, but they're just buying the fucking knockoff Nikes from the factories that are selling them for like really low prices, and then it becomes this thing of like you just can't on the after the non-brand market if you're buying it from the that's not from the actual source and it's not wholesale, you can't tell how cheap you're getting the product like for compared to how much it was made for, and then a lot of times it's just huge ripoffs.
Sounds like it reminds me of the old joke about calling a store closing. Like you
Going
have,
out
because
of
I've seen,
business.
yeah, or going out of business, or all things must go. I've seen a lot of ads lately for organizations, companies saying that they're going out of business. This is on social media, saying that they're going out of business, so they have to sell all their inventory. But I'd never heard of the entity to begin with. So it makes me wonder if there are these shell organizations that just have a bunch of random themed inventory on their back end or just in a warehouse somewhere. And in order to offload it, it's basically being presented under the premise of the organization's going out of business.
Yeah, you reminded me. There was this I think it was a either a bookstore or I think it was like a clothing store in Istanbul. They had like a 50% clearance sale constantly, but the stickers were in the window. It was like making it seem like they were going out of business constantly, but that shit was there damn near the entire time I lived there. And it was like there I think there's this approach to marketing where you know, sometimes you'll see grand opening signs that stay out for a year. Like there's a massage parlor, like foot massage and foot a pedicure place that I think the grand opening sign's still out a year later.
Well, that's a joke in Meet. You can't mess with the Zohan. And I pointed out that to my dad at one point. He said, "Oh yeah, they had those in New York when I lived there." So I think that's actually a long-standing tradition. Like
To
it,
what grand
the
opening sign?
the going out of business or the grand opening for a year or the name of the store is grand opening.
Uh,
The name of the store is going out of business.
yeah,
That's really, I think that's really what it is. They uh they can't help themselves.
yeah. Customers they think they're getting a deal. They're like, oh, let me go check it out. 20% off. Oh shit. I don't care what the original price was. 20% though.
20% off is the original price.
Right. Exactly. Well, that's where you see a lot of these big department stores before COVID and before well, I guess it was technically after the Great Recession hit. They would end up marking their stuff up and then marking it down. So it would be like, oh, this pair of pants was $400. It's 90% off now. And it's like, well, was it ever actually $400? Because I would never pay $400 for these pants, but y'all acting like they were super expensive. But it was this pricing gouging trick that wasn't actual price gouging, but it was like fake gouging to make them look like they're giving you a deal. And I would see that shit in like Macy's and Express. There's a few places that were doing it where I'm like, this is like way too obvious, y'all. But when your product is like, not really something that people need, then you have to start resorting to those sorts of tricks to get them in.
Well, that's like the funnel. I've noticed the funnel marketing scheme or paradigm for some time now, where at least on the internet they offer something free, or sign up for our free webinar. It starts in a few minutes, but really you're just clicking on a link, and the timer exists only from the moment that you know open it up and said, "Hurry now, sign up for our free webinar, reserve your space," and then it's a hour to 2 hour long sales pitch to get you to buy a book or or the trick to, or the secrets of marketing funnels. That's the best one, the funnel that sells a bigger funnel. And they get you in, they capture your email address, they get all of your contact information. So now you're part of their regular newsletter, their emailer, and or they get you on their RSS feed somehow, because that's part of signing up, is you got to agree to be on the RSS feed, for those of you that still use an RSS feed. And it's kind of insidious, because they promise free stuff, but all they do is promise the promise of more free stuff. Or if you listen to this long enough, you'll get the secrets of success after you buy the book. But you got to listen to the whole thing before they convince you to buy the book. Because if they try to tell you to get the book right off the bat, you'll be like, oh, fuck this shit. It's really crazy. Like, people, they go to great lengths actually to make that happen, and it's just dirty.
Exceptional Radio. Exceptional Randos Show is produced live in Sunroom Studios Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Well, that was random. Exceptional Radio.